Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a consultation specialist with S&C Lavalin. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics as our project moves through consultation round 2 of the environmental assessment phase. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities, so we hope these will help our viewers and listeners better understand the project and provide input along the way. So let's get started. Today, we're going to talk about the proposed criteria and indicators for the evaluation of road corridor alternatives to help community members understand the thinking behind and the activities associated with the process. So, why don't we get started now and go over today's topics? So, what we're going to do is, as we typically do, provide you with a bit of a background, just so that we can make sure if there's any new listeners that they can be brought up to the same level as regular listeners. And so we'll talk a bit about the project background. Then we'll talk about the alternatives assessment process, the evaluation of alternative road corridors, which is the key focus of today's presentation, actually the proposed criteria and indicators for evaluation of road corridor alternatives. And then we'll talk about how you can get in touch with the project team. So just to give everyone a little reminder as to where Webequie First Nation is, let's talk about its location. It is located about 250 kilometers south of Hudson Bay and 250 kilometers roughly west of James Bay in northwestern Ontario. There's three main purposes for the Webequie Supply Road. I'll just remind everyone that Webequie First Nation is the proponent of this project. So they're the project sponsor. They are leading this project. And so they have a purpose, or they have multiple purposes in proposing this project. And the first is to move materials, supplies, and people from the Webequie Airport to the McFalds Lake or Ring of Fire area. The second is to provide employment and economic development opportunities to community members, and at the same time allowing the community to preserve and enhance their language and their culture so they can remain in their communities but still be able to participate in the overall economy. And then finally, uh, in terms of purposes of the supply road, it's to provide experience and training opportunities for youth to help encourage the youth pursuing additional skills through post-secondary education. Now, I've mentioned on previous presentations, streaming sessions, that this is not like an all-season road. Like this is not just the road, the two-lane gravel road. There's a lot more to it. So I'm just going to run through a bit of a description to help explain what's involved in this project. So the planned road itself is planned to be 107 kilometers in length. As I mentioned, extending from the airport in Webequie First Nation to the McFalds Lake area, which is in the Ring of Fire. Now, 17 kilometers of this road would run through Webequie First Nation reserve lands. And then we have what we call a planning corridor that we work within. So we have a preferred corridor for the project, and we'll get into this as we go through the presentation. But that preferred corridor is 2 kilometers wide. And within that 2 kilometer width, we look at route alternatives. And then the actual cleared area, the final corridor width is planned to be 35 meters for a 2-lane gravel surface road. There would be 3 major water body crossings. The first, moving from Webequie, the actual community itself, from where the road starts at the airport, would be at the Winnisk Lake crossing. So that crossing is between the island that the Webequie settlement sits on and the mainland, which is still part of the reserve area. There are two other crossings, major crossings. The next one is to the southeast of the first crossing over Winiscus's Channel, and it's about 35 to 50 meters wide. Though I forgot to mention the Winisk Lake crossing is around 250 meters wide, so that would be a very, very large span bridge. And then the final crossing is just west of the eastern end of the road, and that's over the Mokataw River. And it's about again 35 to 50 meter. It's a 35 to 50 meter wide crossing. So those are the major water body crossings. Obviously, there are other water body crossings. About 23 have been identified, and these would involve use smaller structures such as culverts. And as I mentioned, roads like this involve more than just the two-lane gravel road. There would be temporary and permanent aggregate or rock quarry areas with equipment for processing. So taking rock in the case of quarries where they're mining bedrock and then crushing it or processing it into smaller material that can be used to form the road base for construction or maintenance of the road, and also to create some of the more medium-sized rock that, such as riprap type rock that could be used for protecting culvert outlets. Then we have, during construction at least, so temporary, we would have construction camps. And the construction camps are obviously to accommodate construction crews, and there would also be an operations and maintenance office, which would be permanent, and that would of course include other permanent supportive facilities such as storage of potable water, drinking water, and a small wastewater treatment plant to handle sewage as well. And then, of course, finally, during the construction phase, there would be storage and laydown yards. These would be temporary for equipment and materials used in the course of construction. And of course, these would be temporary areas that would be restored at the project's end. Let's move now to talk about the alternatives assessment process and just review this process itself to remind everyone. So, as part of the environmental assessment process for every undertaking or project, there is, quote, a reasonable range of alternatives must be considered during an environmental assessment. Alternatives include alternatives to and alternative methods. When we talk about alternatives to the proposed undertaking, these are functionally what you call functionally different ways of approaching and dealing with a problem or opportunity. When we talk about alternative methods, we're talking about um, different ways of doing the same activity, essentially. So let's get into some examples that'll hopefully make this a little bit easier to understand. So when we look at alternatives to the proposed undertaking, again, functionally different ways of approaching and dealing with a problem or opportunity. These could be different modes of transport. It could be rail, it could be a hovercraft, like a cargo hovercraft, a cargo airship. Um, lots of different. There's lots of different modes of transport. Um, Another different way of approaching this problem or opportunity, in this case the project, um, is to upgrade existing trails to a seasonal winter road. And in this case, there is no existing trail between the two locations, so it doesn't really fit there. You could manage traffic demand so that the need was less. That's one possibility. You could do nothing. You could just keep it, as they say, keep the status quo, as they say. So keep things the same. Or you could, as is being proposed by Webequie First Nation, develop a new all-season road. Now let's move to alternative methods. When we talk about alternative methods, as I mentioned, They're different ways of doing the same activity. So in the case of an all-season road, this could be this could be different routes. So in our case, we have three alternative routes within a preferred corridor. We have alternative route 1, alternative route 2, and alternative route 3. Let's move now to the proposed criteria and indicators for evaluation of road corridors, which is sort of the core of what we're going to talk about today. And just to review, I've used the terms criteria and indicators before. Well, let's look at criteria itself. Criteria and value components are basically one and the same thing. So these are, and I'll read you the definition that you can see on the screen here, but they're the environmental, health, social, economic, or additional elements or conditions of the natural and human environment that may be affected by the project and are of concern or value to the public, indigenous peoples, federal, provincial authorities, and interested parties. So these are the things that are important, that people have identified as being important, that they want studied. So for example, some of the ones that have been identified to date for the Webequie Supply Road project are geology, terrain and soils, surface water, groundwater, air quality, climate change, noise, vegetation and wetlands, fish and fish habitat, wildlife, archaeological resources, built heritage, cultural heritage resources, socioeconomic environment, indigenous land and resource use, Aboriginal and treaty rights and interests, visual environment, and human health. Again, many valued components, as you can see, from that slide. There's a lot of valued components. There is a lot that makes up a environmental assessment. It is a very thorough process that looks at a very broad definition of the environment. And I think you probably saw that if we can bring that slide back, when I'm talking about the environment, there's the natural environment, there's health, there's social, there's economic, and so there's the human environment, the natural environment. So environment's a big, broad term. So there's many things that are studied. It's not just wildlife and vegetation, as you can tell. I just read you a long list of valued components. Okay, let's move to talk a bit about indicators. Indicators represent the resource, feature, or issue related to a valued component that, if changed, may demonstrate an effect on the environment. So it's sort of a way of measuring um, impacts, and it's associated with valued components. And then another description, as you may have seen there, is a measurement of potential effects to be used to assess and evaluate the alternative routes and the overall effects of the project. So you can use these indicators to help, in our case, identify the alternative routes and evaluate the alternative routes, and then also to identify the overall effects of the project. Let's talk a little bit now about study areas for valued components. So each valued component has its own unique study area, and that unique study area is derived from lots of different from input from a lot of different areas. The best way to describe it, I guess, input from Indigenous communities or groups. Um, Basically, experts providing an anticipated extent based on their professional expertise and experience for that valued component. Indigenous knowledge that communities are willing to share to help identify valued components, and then also help identify study areas associated with those. Current or traditional land and resource use by Indigenous communities, exercise of Aboriginal and treaty rights of Indigenous peoples, including cultural, and spiritual practices as well. And then finally, physical, ecological, technical, social, health, environment, and cultural considerations. So there's a lot there in just that one point I mentioned there. So there's a lot that goes into the definition of study areas associated with valued components. So why don't we now move into talking a little bit more specifically about select valued components, just to give you a better idea to illustrate exactly what valued components are, and then some sample indicators, example indicators for specific valued components. So we'll look at wildlife, for example, here. So on the left-hand side, in the left-hand column, I have criteria or valued component. They mean one and the same thing. We have things like forest birds, raptors, shorebirds, waterfowl, wetland birds, bats, fur-bearing animals like marten, ungulates like moose and caribou, but caribou is excluded in this particular case. Amphibians and reptiles, and then pollinating insects. So all those valued components would have the same general indicators. So let's go through these just to help illustrate what I mean when I talk about indicators. So some of them could be changes to habitat, what we call habitat availability, which is a combination of both quantity. So let's think of land area or water area and quality of that habitat. So, for example, if for caribou, there are certain areas that are considered a very high quality for caribou as a caribou habitat because of maybe the mix of vegetation that's in those particular areas. If it's a maybe a nursery area or an area, um, it might be an area that's a little bit more remote and less accessible to predators. So that's an example of habitat availability, quality and quantity. And then we talk about changes to abundance. Abundance meaning populations, and distribution meaning um, the area over which, like the land or water area over which a species would travel or use. And then even within that, you have the connectivity of it. So, for example, if you're talking about birds, birds, certain species like heavily forested areas, but if those areas get fragmented or separated through development, for example, that can impact the quality of that habitat for a particular species. It just depends on the species. And then you have things like changes to species richness. When we talk about species richness, we talk about diversity, number of species. And then changes to survival and reproduction, maybe survival rates of a particular animal might have changed as a result of a project or development. And then reproductive rates might have changed as well too, so you're not getting the growth in the population. Changes to predator access. Maybe a development could increase access by predators and then causing population changes in their prey. Use of habitat, population associated with predators as well. Change in wildlife mortality. The death rates of wildlife could be from lots of different things. Could be, I have on the screen here, due to increase in anthropogenic stressors. Now, what does that mean? That means man-made, man-created um, impacts or things that can impact uh, a the mortality, how long or the how long a particular animal lives. For example, vehicle travel could be part of that too. There could be mortality associated with travel along the community, the all-season road as well. Let's move now to the next slide and talk a little bit about caribou, for example. So some of the indicators for the valued component caribou could be population size or trend estimates. Again, similar to what we just talked about, indirect mortality due to increases in prey sources leading to higher levels of predation by wolves, bears, etc., or the spread of disease. Um, Maybe light and sound that's created as a result of a project being built. Those might have indirect impacts on caribou. Um, there could be, again, we get back to that word anthropogenic, man-made impacts from collisions with vehicles or increased hunting pressure. Habitat availability, again, we're talking about quality and quantity of habitat. Um, and then, I mentioned earlier talking about different um, uh, quality levels of habitat for wildlife. So you have, for example, with caribou, you have category one, which is a high use area. And you could measure the area of the total area of high use areas. And then you have category two and category three areas. Category two is seasonal ranges, and then category three is the other areas left over. So again, these are more examples of indicators for caribou as the valued component or criteria as well. And next slide. And basically, this just provides you an example of some of the baseline data that we've been collecting and some of the results or observations that we've made. So we've conducted spring and fall aerial water bird surveys in 2019 and 2020, sampled waterfowl and shorebird, done population estimates based on observations as they migrated to and from their breeding grounds in the spring and in the fall. Uh, we did surveys of wetlands and along water courses. For the road corridor as well too. And then in terms of some of our findings, large lakes serve as staging areas, very major staging areas for waterfowl, and smaller lakes and rivers aren't really used that much by migrating waterfowl. So I hope this was helpful today. If we can move to the next slide, the intent is to try to break down the environmental assessment process so that community members can better understand the thinking behind it and appreciate how comprehensive it is and thorough it is. And we want to really encourage community members to provide input on this project and to keep in contact with us. We have some contact information for you up on the screen. We definitely encourage you to go to our website, supplyroad.ca, and we would love to visit your community to talk to you about the project and get more input from you. Or we can meet with you in whatever way you would prefer, following your consultation protocols, of course. So I hope you take advantage of that and contact. We keep in contact through social media, as you can see there too, and we really look forward to getting to your community, hopefully, and talking to you and just sharing information as much as we can about the project and being as transparent as possible, because we want this environmental assessment to be as comprehensive as possible for the benefit of everyone. So that wraps up today's discussion of the proposed criteria and indicators for the evaluation of road corridor alternatives. We hope it was helpful and encourages you to join us again in 2 weeks. Don't forget to keep in touch with our project team members via the contact information that you can see on your screen right now. And as I mentioned before, through our website, supplyroad.ca, there is a ton of information available on our website. Uh, and you can learn lots of you can get lots of information about the project. We've been compiling information over the last few years, so it's pretty thorough, I would say. Miigwech, and we will talk to you again in 2 weeks when we talk about a really interesting topic, the analysis of alternatives using multiple accounts analysis, and explain what this is, because it's kind of complicated on the surface, but I think you'll find it pretty interesting. So join us again in two weeks. Miigwech, and see you soon.